Ladies and gentlemen, I know there are people coming in and out, but I think we need to keep to time. I'm Gerald Vernon-Jackson. I'm the Lib Dem leader here at the LGA. And I think we're very pleased to have Norman Lamb, the Shadow Minister for Health, here to talk to us. I'm particularly pleased that Norman is here and prepared to sit next door to me. Many years ago, he came to a birthday party of mine in Prague, and I think I have to say at the restaurant I had too much to drink, and I hit Norman very vigorously around the head, and his glasses shot to the other end of the restaurant. So Norman, thank you for coming. It's not that dangerous tonight, I hope. In the world of politics, where people seem to be obsessed about personalities, I think we're here to talk about something very different. I think some of the really serious issue for the day is around mental health and the number of people who are excluded from their from lives in a meaningful sense, who live lives of loneliness and pain, and the work that Norman has been doing to try to make sure that we really concentrate on the issue of mental health and how serious it is and how important it is that we treat it with the equity that is needed. Not just physical health needs to be looked after, but mental health as well. So Norman, and I understand you're also going to say a bit about what your work is in Birmingham has been. So Norman Lamb, thank you very much indeed.
Well, I'm not someone to bear a grudge. I'd completely forgotten about the incident in Prague, it has to be said. So you've got away with it, Gerald. Very good to be here on this glorious day. I took a photograph of the bay out there. It's just looking stunning. So I wanted to start by talking a bit about the state of health and social care in our country and the challenge that we face. 1 year, of course, on from the implementation of the CARE Act, which I took through Parliament. And then I want to end by talking about the work that I'm doing in the West Midlands. I was asked to chair a commission on mental health for the combined authority there. And I think there are some quite exciting ideas, which perhaps starts to paint a picture of a way forward for the way in which the public sector supports some of our most vulnerable people. So my starting point is that I am totally committed to making the system focus much more, first of all, on integrated care, joining up care around the needs of the individual, which too often it completely fails to do. I'm committed also to a fundamental shift towards a greater focus on preventive care. Again, our system, our NHS and care system fails to do that, and I'll come back to that a little later on. And I am totally committed also to that rather horrible word personalisation, but it's about giving power to people, some control over their lives in the way in which the system works. And for all of those reasons, I'm very proud of the CARE Act, but I am also fearful that it will fail to deliver on its potential because of the extraordinarily difficult financial circumstances we find ourselves in. Since the general election, we've seen the loss of the care cap and the extension to means-tested support for people with care needs. Now, the government says that it is postponed until 2020. I think in reality it has gone. I see no realistic prospect that the finances of the NHS and the care system will be better in 2020 than they were this year when the decision was taken to delay it because of the tough financial circumstances. So I fear that it has gone for good, and that leaves me very frustrated because I think that this was government at its best. As a coalition, we commissioned Andrew Dilnot, an expert and an economist, to come up with a recommendation for how best to fund social care. We implemented through legislation his recommendations, and now, sadly, it's been abandoned. And the financial picture in social care, first of all, seems to me to be extraordinarily challenging. The Health Foundation, independent of government, has estimated that the gap in social care funding by 2020 will be about £6 billion. That doesn't include about another £1 billion for the cost of increasing the minimum wage. So roughly speaking, £7 billion. Now, the LGA estimates that if every council in every part of the country increases council tax by the 2% precept permitted, that this will raise about 1.8 billion by 2020. And we know that the Better Care Fund will bring in hopefully another 1.5 billion, but we can all see that that leaves a very significant gap. And bear in mind the very substantial efficiency savings that have already been driven through social care over the last 5 or 6 years. That causes me massive concern. And Simon Stevens, the Chief Executive of NHS England, has warned if you leave a gap in social care, it simply increases the gap in the NHS. There is no way of escaping this. And it also means that people end up unnecessarily in hospital, and that is a failure of the system. So this inadequate resourcing of preventive services that are made up within the social care system is, I think, a flawed prospectus. Now, in the NHS, on that side of the divide, the common view is that the gap in funding by 2020 will be in the region of £30 billion. Now, the government has committed to 8 to 10 billion of that, but there is no one in the sector, no one that I have come across of any standing, who believes that we will be able to achieve efficiency savings of about £20 billion by 2020. It requires heroic assumptions about efficiency savings between now and then, and I do not believe that they can be achieved. And I'm someone who absolutely is up for changing the way in which the system works to make it more efficient and more effective. And here's the thing. Between now and 2020, we are projected to spend a reducing percentage of our national income on health and care at a time when demand, because we're all living longer and we're living with chronic conditions that in the past would have killed us, demand is rising by about 4% every year. Now, you can't ultimately carry on like that without the system crashing, and that's really what I fear. Now, the consequences of this are really very serious. First of all, let me address the financial position. And there is a real frustration for me that different rules and culture increase the distortion of where the money goes in the system. So whilst local authorities are subject to very strict rules on financial discipline, and mental health trusts have a culture whereby they stick to the block grant funding that they have been given by their clinical commissioning group, meanwhile, acute trusts stack up enormous deficits. But what then happens? They get bailed out after the event by payments from the Department of Health, which in effect endorse overspending after the event. But this simply distorts the share of spending within the NHS and the care system between the acute sector and the preventive services, which are the very services that stop people ending up in hospital. It's a flawed system. Financial incentives that do not add up, that are not aligned, and that result in suboptimal outcomes for patients. So the result of all of this is that in 15-16, NHS trusts had a total deficit of £2.45 billion. Imagine that in local government, nearly 3 times greater than the previous year, 14-15, when the deficit was £822 million. But this isn't just about deficits and balance sheets. It's about patients. It's about people. And they suffer as a result of what is happening in our health and care system. So just by way of example, we did an FOI survey recently. 4 times as many people waiting more than 2 hours to be handed over at an A&E department from the ambulance to A&E. 4 times more than just 3 years ago. Some waiting more than 9 hours. This is not a blip. This is a trend that was growing worse inexorably. An ambulance leader told me this week that delays across the country are killing people. He said there is no doubt this is happening because many of the people that ambulance services go to are in life and death situations. And if ambulances are stuck at acute hospitals, they cannot get to those patients. So lives are put at risk. The number of bed days lost through delayed discharge is at the second highest level on record. 167,000 delayed days, up from 116,000 2 years ago. Now, this is not just bad economics, it's bad care. Because if people are stuck in acute hospitals, they become more dependent. It costs more to care for them thereafter, but it denies them the independence that is so important to people. So it is a failure again of the system. And 400,000 fewer people receiving social care than 5 years ago. Children's mental health still horribly underfunded. About 0.7% of the total NHS budget is spent on children's mental health. About 75% of children and young people with mental health needs get no help at all. Now, we secured in the budget last year £1.25 billion extra investment in children's mental health over the course of this Parliament. That's £250 million a year. But we have to watch very closely, because in year one it wasn't £250 million, it was £143 million. And not all of that got spent on children's mental health. And in this year, this current financial year, it's now just become part of the baseline funding of clinical commission groups. So there is no guarantee at all that this money will be spent as intended on children's mental health. There is a desperate need for this investment. And you get a return on your investment, because about 75% of adult mental health starts before the age of 18. But if we neglect it at that age, the consequences in adulthood are dire, and we could be doing so much better. And it is this dysfunctional system which totally distorts the financial priorities, the financial incentives, driving money through payment by results or payment for activity into acute hospitals, taking money away from those preventive services, leaves me in a degree of despair. And the inadequate investment compared to almost every other European country. So that is why I asked Alan Milburn, Labour former Secretary of State for Health, and Stephen Dorrell, former Conservative Secretary of State for Health, to join with me in calling for a cross-party commission to come up with a new settlement for the NHS and care. And I absolutely stress and care. We must see the two together. And we need that new settlement. We need to have an honest discussion with the public about how we fund these services, how much people are prepared to pay in tax. Do we need to increase tax to ensure that we have a decent, civilised health and care system? I floated the idea of a dedicated health and care tax so that people can see where the money is going. It's the only area of public spending where the demand just rises inexorably. We need to think about these things and debate them in the public domain. So a new Beveridge report for the 21st century. But however dire the finances, we all of us, wherever we are in the system, whether we are policymakers, whether we're challenging from opposition, whether we're working in local government or in the NHS, we have a responsibility to make the very best use of resources that are available, to challenge old ways of doing things, the dreadful silos that so often let people down, the disjointed care. And that's in essence the work that I'm doing in the West Midlands. And I applaud the combined authority there. They decided, as part of their devolution deal with the Treasury, to set up a commission on mental health, to look at how much mental ill health is costing the economy in the West Midlands, and to ask the critical question, could we spend that money more effectively to achieve better results for people and to get an economic return? And I applaud Sarah Norman, the Chief Executive of Dudley Council, whose idea it was to do this. West Midlands leading the way in looking at new ways of doing things. And I also, incidentally, applaud the Conservative and Labour leaders in the West Midlands who had faith in me, a Liberal Democrat, to lead this process. I appreciate it. So we are looking across the whole of the public sector, not just in the NHS and care, and beyond the public sector, to find better ways of doing things. And just to give you a flavour, we are looking, for example, at how we can keep people better in employment. So many people end up out of work unnecessarily because their employers haven't been effective enough at supporting either their mental health or their physical health, their well-being, and maintaining their employment. So we're looking at whether we can introduce a fiscal incentive. This was floated by Simon Stevens in the 5-year forward view. Could we, through the business rate and the devolved responsibility for the business rate, offer some sort of incentive for employers to engage in the well-being of their staff? And we're calling it a well-being premium. We're exploring it with NHS England to see whether we could make it work. And we would combine it potentially with procurement rules so that we encourage every company, every organisation that bids for public sector contracts. Do they sign up to this commitment to the well-being of their staff? And if they do, then they benefit from it in the procurement process. And I think this would be really significant if we could trial this across the whole region. I don't know whether we'll pull it off, but it seems to me to be worth trying. Then on people who are out of work, we are looking at whether we can roll out individual placement and support. It has a massive evidence base on intensive support to get people with severe and enduring mental ill health back into work. Could we roll it out across the whole of the West Midlands in accordance with what Paul Farmer in his task force report argued for? On housing, we all know that a secure home is the foundation stone for all of us here to function as individuals. But if you're a rough sleeper with mental ill health, perhaps with substance misuse problems or alcohol problems, a home is the very last thing that you can enjoy or benefit from. It's perhaps there at the very end of the rainbow. If you go through the hostel, if you go through a halfway house, you may at some future point in your life get your own home. Well, Housing First, a concept pioneered in Finland and in Canada, turns that on its head. It gets people straight into a secure home with intensive support and then enabling them to become more stable and then to confront their other issues. And the evidence shows that it is very effective. In the criminal justice system, it is surely a scandal of our time that there are so many people who end up in prison essentially because of their mental ill health or because they have a learning disability or autism. We surely need to end this. And so we're working with the Ministry of Justice to see whether we could introduce and pioneer the use of mental health treatment orders. This is a sentencing option that is available to judges, but it is never used across our country. It's been there for years. But because you need to get mental health trusts, the police, the probation services, the judiciary together to make it happen, it never happens. So let's try and trailblaze a much greater use of treatment orders to keep people out of prison and to give them the chance of a better life. There are all sorts of things we want to do within the NHS to end the outrageous practice of out-of-area placements, which we know leads to a greater risk of suicide for those people sent out of area in search of a bed. We want to radically reduce the use of restraint in our mental health services. We want to end the practice of putting people into police cells at a moment of mental health crisis. And we want to focus on the principle of early intervention. We know there's wealth of evidence with early intervention in psychosis that if you give that person treatment straight after a first episode of psychosis, you can rescue that person. You can give them the chance of a good life. If you neglect it, then that person stands the chance of a life on benefits, a life with difficult relationships, at enormous cost to the state. So let's do it properly. Let's intervene quickly and give those people the chance of a better life. And then finally, we're looking at whether we can implement the concept of zero suicide across the whole of a region. Go to Detroit, where they have done this, inspiring local leaders, changing the way that organisations work, focusing on prevention of deterioration of condition, a positive learning culture so that every time there is a tragedy, everyone learns and implements the changes from that learning. They have radically reduced the number of people who lose their life through suicide. And if you look at the developments in healthcare across the world, we have made dramatic improvements in the reduction in early loss of life through conditions like heart disease, like stroke, like diabetes, and so on. But in mental health, that death toll just continues as high as ever. We have got to be as ambitious for people with mental ill health as with everyone else. Now, let me just end by saying that at a time when public services face an existential threat, putting some of the most vulnerable people at risk and potential loss of life, it seems to me that there is a massive imperative for all of us to find new ways of doing things, ending the silos, challenging the vested interests, giving hope and optimism to the brilliant people who work in health and care and in other public services, to feel that their efforts can, despite tough times, change people's lives. Thank you very much indeed.
Colleagues, we've got just a few minutes with Norman because he's got a train and he needs to be through that door by 5 o'clock at the absolute latest. So we've got a couple of minutes for questions. I've got one in the middle here from John. And if you could stand up if you've got a mic. So anybody else apart from John wanting to ask a question? Okay, let's start there then.
Norman, John Boyce, Oadby and Wigston, or in this instance, John Boyce carer. There is a lady who lives with us who is 59 years old. She has a learning disability, she has Down syndrome, and she has dementia. I could spend hours going through some of the inefficiencies in the system, but I'll ask one simple question. She has 2 care plans. One is health, which is about a page long, and most of it is empty and blank, because it's assumed we know what we're doing, we're caring appropriately. The other one is from social services, which is 15 pages of repetitive and, dare I say, prescriptive nonsense, and the two do not seem to work in any sense together. If we're going to make efficiencies, now some of it will result in savings, but basically it will result in better care if we can find some way of integrating those 2 care plans.
Okay.
Well, I totally agree. My view is that we need to end the divide between health and social care. For any individual who has needs, health or care needs, they don't see a divide. They are a single person with needs, and the way in which the public services respond to those needs ought to be, we have an obligation to make them joined up. And the idea of someone with a learning disability having 2 care plans is an outrage if we think about it for more than a moment, particularly if both of them are pretty vacuous in different ways. So I think we need to set ourselves on a path to a complete pooling of resource in every locality. I said at the general election last year it should happen by 2018, but there should be a progression to get there. I wanted to use the Better Care Fund as the mechanism to do it. My sadness is that if anything it seems to be withering on the vine rather than being built upon. But that's, I think, the direction of travel. I also incidentally think that we need to end this awful divide between physical health and mental health, which too often treats the mind and the body as different things, and it's ridiculous.
Okay. Another one over there, in 3rd row from the front.
Thank you, Councillor Ruth Dombey, leader of London Borough of Sutton. I was very proud to be on a panel session this morning talking about the integration of health and social care, and an extraordinary story coming out from Plymouth City Council about how they are integrating not just across health and social care, but also their community safety budgets and other parts of the public sector as well. I think it's really important that we share this information, because at the end of the day, a proper integration of health and social care can't be top down. It's going to have to happen on the ground. It's going to have to be the health and well-being boards that are the drivers for this. And in fact, it's going to be local government which is going to make this happen, because we are the only part of the public sector that can bring together all the public sector partners and the private partners and the voluntary and community sector to make this happen. So I would encourage everyone to have a look not just at Plymouth, but also some other very good examples of integration across the country, because I think we can all learn from each other.
Well, I totally agree with that, Ruth, and we need to sort of plagiarise wherever we can, avoid reinventing the wheel. We need to learn within this country, but we also need to look overseas. I talked about Housing First, pioneered in Finland and Canada. I've been very inspired in the United States by their work on zero suicide and on reducing the use of force in mental health settings. So, you know, we should not worry where the ideas come from, but the system traditionally is not very good at applying best practice. I mentioned individual placement and support, a wealth of evidence to support it, but very rarely commissioned. And one of the problems is that health is expected to commission it, but the Department for Work and Pensions is the body that gains the most benefit from it. So it doesn't happen. So we need to try and join these different forces of the public sector together. And I totally agree with you that it's local government that can initiate, that's what's exciting in the West Midlands. It's local authorities in the West Midlands coming together to force change, and sometimes the sort of burning platform that we're experiencing now forces people to think afresh, and we need that fresh thinking.
Norm, just to finish, having sat through and looked at social services budgets for years, and the way in which local authorities manage them and manage them so that we stay within budget seems to be a complete contrast to what the NHS does. And if there are ways in which our way of working can move into the NHS, it would seem to me there is a huge benefit for everybody, and maybe that's a message. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed, Norman, for speaking to us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.